Good morning, everybody. Uh, Adelita, thank you very much for inviting me to address such an important conference. This is a conference for domestic and international security for women in Albania, and I'm truly honored to be able to address you all on this important subject. Special congratulations to Adelita Titina for hosting and organizing this conference, and also my gratitude for inviting me. As per your instructions, I will limit myself to 15 to 20 minutes, and I will essentially talk about how the United States as a country and as also a government determines what are its national security concerns, what are the processes through which we determine this, and then we then proceed to execute the national security policy. I will not be delving much into how the policy is executed. For example, I will not be talking about intelligence issues or talking about military operations or essentially the activities of the Department of Defense. I'm more concerned with the intellectual side of the conversation. How do we determine what is America's national security, and how do we go about essentially identifying the threats to America's national security. So I'm going to begin by sharing, I'm new to Zoom, so please bear with me if I make some errors. This is the first time I'm using this software, but I'm going to try and use a PowerPoint that I have prepared just for this occasion. I so wish that I could be with you in person. Even though I'm a Gemini, I can't be in two places at the same time. When you are listening to me via video, I will be in Trinidad and Tobago speaking at another conference. I guess the beaches have won out. Anyway, to introduce myself, my name is Muqtada Khan. I'm a professor at the University of Delaware. And I'm also a senior fellow at a small think tank in Washington, DC called Center for Global Policy. And this is a brief conversation about America's national security process for the Institute for Women in National and International Security in Tirana, Albania, from the 1st to the 4th of October, 2019. I want to argue and suggest to you that factors that shape national security policy in the United States can be very easily and broadly defined under these two rubrics, that those, the external threat environment and security challenges which come from outside the United States, changes that are happening in the security environment, changes that are happening in global power structures, changes that are happening in global economy, all of those things that could hurt American interests, especially American security. Those are the things that I put under this rubric of external threat environment. And internal challenges or determinants of national security could be changes in the politics of the United States, ideological shifts from government to government, and also economic conditions, which will have an impact on America's capacity to defend itself and also determines its global reach. So the first thing that I want to talk about, for example, of the security challenges that we face today is that Russia is showing a more aggressive foreign policy, especially in the Middle East. And in Europe, Russia's policy towards Ukraine, its annexation of the Crimea, all of this suggests that Russia is now once again beginning to challenge the United States and its allies in Western Europe. And therefore, the United States perceives the more aggressive Russian posture, both in Europe and in the Middle East, especially in Syria, as something that not only may undermine US interests in the region, may destabilize the region, but also challenge US hegemony, and therefore the United States needs to address growing Russia's aggressiveness on the global stage. And so this is an example of an external threat, a change in the global environment. This is important, and I will explain to you later, or maybe I can do it now. The the rise of Russia, at least the increase in Russian aggressiveness, essentially is altering America's national security policy, because once again, the US is now looking at the world as the return of geopolitics as the game of great powers. So once again, with the rise of Russia, we see the United States seeing less of a threat to its national security coming from non-state actors like Al-Qaeda and ISIS, and seeing that the bigger threat is now coming from a state actor like it used to during the Cold War. Some of the threats are directly militarily, and some of them are threats to America's democracy, given Russia's intervention in American elections in 2016. So Russia's hybrid warfare is now threatening America and changing the security environment, thereby necessitating a shift in America's national security policy. The second, of course, is the rise of China. China is rising, it's becoming a great power. In purchasing power terms, it is already the biggest economy in the world, with its ability to spend more on defense, its Belt and Road Initiative, through which it is reintegrating the world into a Chinese economic sphere. Some people call it debt diplomacy. But the rise of China will inevitably force the United States to share global domination or the responsibility of maintaining global order with China. China is a beneficiary of the current global order, but it is not that big a supporter or underwriter of that global order. The question remains, will the United States continue to underwrite the global order, which is going to eventually crown China as the most important and most powerful country in the world? So the rise of China also necessitates a rethinking in American national security. We have to ask this question: how will China's increased military and economic power affect US interests overseas and at home? The Middle East instability and mass migration. The United States for the last, 20, 30 years has been fighting many wars in the Middle East. There is a chance that we might see another major war with Iran. The probability has increased since last month. The United States is still in Iraq. Still, the US has presence in Syria. And so the Middle East instability and the mass migration that it has precipitated in the last 4 or 5 years, which is impacting the demography of the West, particularly Europe, which is also triggering the rise of white nationalism, aggressive nationalist postures, which are undermining the liberal global order, liberal institutions. It is triggering the reassertion of the Westphalian nation state. And all of this is happening because of the instability of the Middle East. And so US national security and the order that it has created in order to advance US interests are now in jeopardy, and therefore US national security policy must address Middle East instability and mass migration. The decline of US hegemony, it is clear, at least in the last few years, that the United States is not as respected worldwide as it used to in the past. People do not look at the United States as a moral leader anymore. And therefore, if the United States wants to get anything done in the region, it cannot lead by example anymore. It has to essentially wield the carrot or the stick. And with the decline of hegemony, essentially it means that the transaction cost of every global policy will increase. The US will have to spend more of its capital in order to achieve its goal with the decline in its hegemony. And the question remains whether the decline of US hegemony is good for the world at large. I'm one of those who feels that the US, in spite of all its foreign policy sins, is a very important player in maintaining global order. And US foreign policy, to some extent, provides global public goods. And so the decline of US hegemony may not necessarily be good for even those countries who have suffered at the hands of US unilateralism in the past. Then there are internal political trends which also impact US national security policy: the rise of white nationalism, this re-emergence of the ethnic state has an impact, for example, on US immigration policy and the so-called Muslim ban, and the horrendous tactics that are being used on a southern border in order to prevent migration, are all stemming probably from the fear that the demographic changes in the United States may make the white population of this country a minority, and therefore you're seeing a resurgence of white nationalism. The rise of evangelical Christianity and its incredible influence on the current administration is also an important factor, important domestic factor in shaping US national security. President Donald Trump's speech at the UN today talked up this week was addressing the issue of religious freedom overseas, and this agenda of promoting religious freedom overseas essentially is one of the biggest interests of evangelical Christians who want to promote and proselytize overseas. And they feel that Christians are being oppressed in many parts of the world, and Christians are not being allowed to promote Christianity in many parts of the world. And so now US foreign policy will become an instrument of Christian evangelism overseas. Rise of social justice Democrats. This is a new trend on the left in the United States, and it could affect US foreign policy. For example, there are many social justice Democrats who are questioning United States, shall we say, uncritical support of Israel. And there are many voices which are very critical of US relations with Israel. And so that is another domestic trend which can impact US relations with its allies and also potentially change its national security policy. But at the moment, you could argue that evangelical Christians have far more impact on US foreign policy, US national security policy than social justice Democrats, who are just beginning to have some political impact in the Congress. So you could argue that social justice Democrats have some support in the Congress, whereas the executive branch is essentially, to a great extent, under the influence of evangelical Christians. And finally, there is an inherent fear of the international order in the United States, a peculiarity. It is like some of the strange things that happen in the United States. For example, aliens only kidnap Americans, if you've noticed in movies and novels, etc. I think this is one of those public urban myths that international order, international organizations are undermining US sovereignty, and United Nations has more influence on the US and its policies than the other way around. So these are some of the domestic, this is not an exhaustive list. I just wanted to give you an idea of how domestic ideas, domestic ideological trends can impact a national security policy. The United States makes both the concept of national security strategy and a product of national deliberation. I don't know what did I write there. Anyway, the point that I was trying to make, that both what is national security and what are the threats to our national security are a process of deliberation. So democracy in the United States does have a very serious influence on how we determine what is our national security. Just the concept of what is national security. And so you find that these are on the right side, on my right side, yeah, on your right side too. You will see that I have listed some of the institutions in this country which impact how we think about national security and how we determine what our threats are. The executive branch, obviously the Department of Defense, Department of State, the Directorate of National Intelligence, all of these agencies are involved in determining what are the threats that America faces, what are our interests, which could be undermined, from threats overseas and maybe even internally, and what we should do to safeguard those. The Congress, obviously, through its allocation of budgets, through its hearings, through its oversight, also plays a role in identifying national security threats. The media plays a big role in the United States. Professors and scholars, through their articles, journalists, through their coverage, are able to monitor the world, the changes in the world, the changes in global structures, the emerging security threats, both state and non-state. All of these are covered in the media, and to a great extent, the media does shape how we think about our national security, and therefore, the issue of fake news, manipulation of media by foreign powers has become a very important security aspect of democratic societies. In those societies where the media plays an important role, and the media is free to some extent, then they are also susceptible to influence by foreign powers, which would then undermine. So you could argue that in the past few years, especially after the 2016 elections, after we were able to understand the enormous extent to which the Russian counterintelligence or Russian intelligence operatives were able to influence US elections through media and social media, has exposed the vulnerabilities of democracies to this hybrid attack. Lobbyists, think tanks, and public interest groups obviously play a big role. If you don't understand how lobbyists play, you can just look at the gun culture in this country. More than 80% of Americans would like to see control on assault weapons and guns in this society. And nearly every other day, we see a mass shooting. Literally, thousands of Americans are being killed and massacred. This is the biggest national security threat to the United States, but thanks to the power of lobbies and gun lobbies and their ability to literally buy and own senators and congressmen, and also shape people's values. There are millions of Americans who just vote on the Second Amendment or on the issue of owning guns. So these lobbyists and think tanks and interest groups thereby shape how we think about national security. In an ideal world, we should be thinking the proliferation of guns and the deaths that they cause in this country as a major threat to national security, but we don't talk about it that way. And that is an indication of the corrupting impact of lobbies on US national security, or in fact, US public policy thinking in most areas. Sometimes these groups can be beneficial, but often they have a deleterious impact on public policy. University research is an important source. Professors like me who write books, give presentations, etc., identify long-term national security interests, trends. We look at the history of great powers, etc. So academic research is also an important input in thinking about national security. And of course, there's foreign impact. Foreign governments can employ lobbyists, and they can now influence think tanks by giving a lot of money. And many think tanks in Washington, D.C. are now, in order to expand globally or to increase their competitive advantage at home, are willing and open to take money from proxies representing foreign interests. And therefore, you will find think tanks muddying conversations about national security by presenting the security interests of foreign countries as American national interests. Finally, I think this is my last slide. I'm going to identify a few challenges to America's national security. We have a very robust culture of public debate, and all those players I just identified, all of them play a significant role in shaping what are the threats that we need to address and how we should address them. For example, one of the biggest debates that's going on now is how to deal with the impact of the drone attacks on Saudi oil fields, for example. Should we impose more sanctions on Iran? Should we start a war with Iran, punish Iran, isolate it more, or engage with it more? All of these discussions are happening in the public sphere. So the public sphere is very important uh, in America's national security thinking, much more than many other places where foreign policy is part of a very elite section of the society, and also within the government. Very few people around the executive, chief executive, tend to have impact on foreign policy, but not so in the US. Okay, at the moment, America sees the following as national security threats. I'm going to identify where there's a broad consensus that these are the threats that we face. And I'm also going to identify some that I think we should consider as threats and perhaps are not receiving as much attention as they should. Number one is clearly the rising powers, especially Russia and China. Number two is nuclear proliferation. And nearly everybody is concerned about the impact of China's growth, the impact of Russia's aggressiveness. A large segment of American population is worried about nuclear proliferation, especially with regards to Iran and North Korea. So if you read the national security document that the White House published in October of 2017, you will notice that on a global stage, the global challenges to the United States were identified as Russia and China, and regional challenges, North Korea and Iran, essentially because of their nuclear programs. The third one is illegal immigration, the mass migration of populations, which are happening at such a large scale that they are threatening to impact the demographic composition of Western countries. So this south to north migration is being considered as a major security challenge, both in Europe and in the United States. And the US sees immigration into Europe also as a security challenge to the United States. And of course, we are building a wall on the southern border as part of our combating what we call as illegal immigration. While we may disagree as to how we should deal with refugees and undocumented migrants to the United States, there is a broad consensus that our immigration policy is broken and it needs to be fixed. And unfortunately, there is no consensus on how it needs to be fixed. And you can see that being played out during the elections, the main elections. Not so much in the primaries, but during the main elections, that will be a big issue. And then, of course, international terrorism. Even though ISIS as a caliphate does not exist, ISIS fighters have dispersed and there is threats. You can see that ISIS has become much more stronger in North Africa after sort of merging with Boko Haram. It's also much more stronger in Afghanistan. Many of the fighters have returned to Europe, raising the specter of widespread terrorist attacks. But interestingly, as far as the United States is concerned, all the terrorist attacks in 2018 in the United States and all the deaths that happened as a result of those terrorists were caused by the rise of what we call as white nationalist terrorism in this country. There were no Islamic terrorist attacks in the United States that caused deaths in 2018. Increasingly, the Department of Homeland Security is now identifying white nationalism or right-wing terrorism or domestic terrorism, as we call it in the United States, as an increasing threat. But nevertheless, international terrorism remains a concern across the board, and the United States security apparatus, both the FBI and the CIA at the moment, is still geared towards focusing on these threats. I already spoke about domestic terrorism. There are many who feel that the climate change has become such a serious issue. We are under a serious crisis that it should be treated as the #1 national security threat. While a lot of people on the left and a significant number members of the Democratic Party in the United States would agree that climate change is one of the most important threats to the world and as so to the United States, and should therefore be addressed on a war footing as a national security challenge. I'm very disappointed to see that the democratic debates are not addressing climate change as the #1 threat. The decline of the welfare state seems to be the bigger worry in the United States, at least in the Democratic primary. So we are more concerned about healthcare than environment at the moment, even though environment does play an important role. There is a growing wealth inequity in the United States, which also I think should be studied as a national security threat. It can have a profoundly destabilizing impact on the country and its institutions, and it undermines the very idea of democracy, because profound concentration of wealth in the hands of very few people also leads to concentration of power, and it tends to neutralize or nullify the very idea of democracy. And therefore, I think that both climate change and growing wealth inequity should actually move right up there with the rising powers as a challenge to US national security. And finally, there are those on the right who feel that domestic demographic changes is also a national security challenge and a threat, and therefore should be addressed. So these are some of the challenges that I think that we need to focus on in understanding how US national security works. While there is a lot of public discussion about it, there is also the perception that in the current administration, which is heavily understaffed in the foreign policy area, it is quite possible that the processes which are articulated in our textbooks are not really taking place. Nevertheless, there is a lot of transparency in American national security thinking. There is a lot of transparency and accountability in American foreign policy making. And for those of us who are intellectually interested in that process, it makes for very interesting study. And with that, I will be happy to end my conversation. Adlira has my email and coordinates. If you want to reach me, ask me questions, feel free to do so. I'm going to check out now. Thank you very much.